You're listening to episode 262 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Kim Allen joins us to speak about the challenges and necessities of succession planning in contemporary sanghas. Hi everyone. Before we begin today's episode, I would like to mention that this podcast and the supporting website, discussion forums, our live online practice circle, and other services provided by the Secular Buddhist Association are supported by you. If you find this episode or any other offerings helpful to you in some way, I ask that you take a moment and visit secularbuddhism.org and click on the Contributions button. There are many ways you can help, which are listed on that page, and if you make a donation, it's tax deductible and helps ensure the SBA is able to continue the exploration of secular Buddhism. Thank you. We're glad to have you join us in the conversation. You may be part of a thriving Dharma community. People are actively involved in programming, interest is high, and the head teacher has the unique ability to challenge and inspire you on the path. And then anicca, impermanence, steps in, shuffles the deck, and confusion reigns where wisdom once held sway. Mostly wisdom held sway. Sometimes those who are wonderful teachers and the organizational infrastructure supporting the Sangha have an unintentional gap and haven't gotten around to addressing what might happen in times of change. Who will lead? How will they lead? And what might they do to help with transition before impermanence makes its presence known? Kim Allen began practicing Buddhist meditation in 2003 with Insight teacher Gil Fronsdal, and now serves on the Teachers Council at Insight Santa Cruz. She has also completed the Sati Center's Buddhist chaplaincy training and offers spiritual care and meditation in a hospital. In 2009, she co-founded the Buddhist Insight Network and served as its first president until 2015. She also has a PhD in physics and a master's degree in sustainability and consults to Dharma groups on organizational development and teacher transitions. So sit back, relax, and have a nice rainy day tea. Our guest today is Kim Allen. Kim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Very glad to have you here, and in particular talking about this subject that we have is near and dear to my heart because my early experiences with contemplative practice were challenged by some of the difficulties along this topic we're going to be talking about today. But I'd like you to start us off by telling us about your background.
All right. So I began practice at Gil Fronsdal's meditation center. Well, I had done a little bit before that on my own and with a small group. But when I went to Insight Meditation Center, which is in Redwood City, California, I knew that I had found, the teacher that would be my first teacher in my home. And I trained there for a long time, during which I did some service to the group, which is an all-volunteer center. I served on some committees. I think I was the newsletter editor, and eventually I found my way to the board and became the board president. And through that, I started to connect with other groups that were, other insight groups. There are many of them in the San Francisco Bay Area, so that was where I began. But I started to realize that there were actually quite a lot out there. I was meeting people on retreats, and they're saying, I'm from a center in New York, I'm from a center in Texas. And so, with Gil's suggestion, I ended up getting together people from these groups. And with a few other people, I founded a group called the Buddhist Insight Network, which is an organization for leaders and teachers of insight groups all around the West. So that includes the United States, Canada, Mexico, and even Europe. And we had a series of meetings in particular where leaders from the groups came together and talked about challenges and successes and problems they were facing and inspirations they were having about creating their Dharma groups. And I began to get a larger sense from meeting more and more people that there are certain commonalities, let's say, in running a Dharma group with other nonprofits or with other religious groups or with any kind of organization. And I, in fact, have a background in organizational development and other things, and there started to be some synergies. And then combining that with the realization that the founders of the Insight movement, who were the teachers who have also founded Insight Meditation Society and Spirit Rock and other such organizations, so people like Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg, these folks were getting a little older, starting to teach a little bit less, and they had, spawned all these other groups, but it wasn't necessarily clear that we had undergone a full generational transition in the Insight movement, and I began to wonder what that might look like. So kind of a fruit of my first 7 years with the Buddhist Insight Network was that this paper kind of wanted to be written about teacher transition in the Insight movement. And it just kind of came forth. And I've also, of course, encountered groups in other traditions, Zen and Tibetan groups. So the paper also, it's mostly about the Insight movement, but it's informed, I would say, by some broader research also. I would like to put in a caveat here at the beginning that I will be probably giving some examples about what certain groups have done or what I've seen. And they are all real examples, but I may slightly change the details so as not to identify the group. And these are fairly broad examples, so listeners should not assume that I'm talking about the groups that I'm affiliated with, and they may come from other traditions also.
I suspect a lot of the examples you have may resonate with the people who are listening, that some of the common problems that they're having are patterns that are not unique to individual communities.
That's certainly correct. One thing that we found repeatedly at these meetings we had for leaders is that everyone came thinking that they had unique problems and that they were the only ones who couldn't figure out how to do this. And they discovered that everybody was having that same issue, and there were a lot of different creative ideas out there. I mean, we even had folks in tears at some of these meetings, just so relieved to connect with other people in the same situation, just so happy.
Kim, I'm wondering if you could draw a line or help us distinguish between transmission of the Dharma from evolution of Dharma organizations.
This is a very important question because the transmission of the Dharma is a different matter than the evolution of Dharma organizations. But both of them come into play when a teacher dies or retires. That's almost kind of the intersection point of them. As a teacher, I'm interested in both of these, especially teaching with an organization. But probably what we'll end up talking about is mostly the evolution of Dharma organizations. And some of the points of overlap are important areas of relationship between the teacher and the organization, where there's the possibility for good connection or for some differences of opinion, or for the transition to be smooth, or for it to be a little bit challenging. There's just one story that comes to mind is that there's a famous Zen story often quoted that the fifth ancestor posed a Dharma question to determine his heir, and he asked the various contenders to respond in verse. And a traditionally educated student expressed what appeared to be deep understanding, but then there was also an illiterate laborer who had been working at the monastery, and he demonstrated superior understanding. He actually had to have somebody write it down for him because he couldn't write. And the master understood what they were saying and chose the laborer as his successor, but the other students were not happy about this, the more pedigreed students, and so he also had to help this guy flee from them. And then after a period out in the forest, he was able to return as the sixth ancestor. So this is an example. We don't see things as extreme today, but this is an example where transmission of the Dharma was actually interrupted because of the way the organization was seeing itself. We don't see things that extreme, but we do have cases where even where there's a transition from, a teacher to a well-recognized student coming up into the teacher position, there can be cases where that new teacher style is a little different from what's going on in the organization. And so there's actually a little bit of bumpiness about that transition. Both have to adjust a little bit, as is normal. But that's just some of the ways in which we see the teacher and the organization coming together at this transition point, and the transmission of the Dharma coming into contact with the evolution of the organization.
So let's run through a potential scenario. Let's say there's a community with a strong leader. You're a good teacher, they're charismatic. What are some risks that might inadvertently be in place for that community?
Well, when there's a strong teacher, and in particular when the group has grown up around that teacher. So this is the case where for many of these early founded sanghas that have only had one guiding teacher for much of their time, there is the issue that the teacher kind of embodies the whole culture of the organization, which is great while it's working, and while the teacher is there and keeping his or her energy flowing through everything. But one result of that is that the group doesn't develop its own sense of how to do things, and the culture is accepted as just the way things are. There's never any choice about how the particular norms are set, and so forth. And so and the group in general may be kind of lulled into, it's always going to be this way, this is how it is, let's just go along. And this works well enough, but of course inevitably there is some kind of change. The teacher may retire, move on, or of course eventually die. And then the group can feel, if they haven't done any kind of planning or self-reflection, they can be quite lost in trying to bring in a new leader. How do we do that? What should we do? What things do we have choice about? What were the strictly cultural elements that can be changed easily? Which ones are more, actually critical to the organizational structure, and we shouldn't change them. Many things have never been thought about. This can lead to a lot of chaos in the group, which actually damages its ability to transmit the Dharma, support students, all the good reasons that it exists.
So what are some things that might be done to help reduce those potential problems?
Well, I hate to use such a term, but succession planning or other kinds of thinking ahead of time. It sounds very banal in a sense, but it's actually a very good solution. Partly because, I don't know if it's actually a good solution because of the particular plan that gets put in place, but the process of doing that is really important. Actually, it was once said that the plan is useless, but planning is essential, something like that.
Yeah. And that really does raise a good point, is that by just exploring what that would be like to go through that change helps people realize what are some of the gaps that need addressing.
Exactly. And so there are particular areas to focus on for example. One of them is to actually take a good look at what the group is doing. How is it actually structured? Few groups have actually thought about this because they tend to build up organically. And, first there's the one volunteer who is opening and closing the door and maybe doing the recording. Then eventually they add in more people. They've found an organization. They get a board. And then eventually there's more and more folks doing a lot of different things. And no one has ever really thought about who's in place doing what functions are the most essential. So an easy way, maybe to think at a top level is that a good structure for a spiritual organization is that there are three legs. So there's a person who's in the teacher role, providing spiritual presence and guidance of some kind. And then there's a strong board that consists of people with diverse skills in governance, finance, communication, etc. And then there's some kind of an administrative leader, like an executive director, who heads up the management of the organization. And what happens is that the founding teacher, like a strong teacher, will play many of these roles. And so then it becomes invisible that these various structures are actually needed. And so it can help to actually write down who's doing what in order to figure out what would need to be done if that leader were not in place.
Do you think there's some differences between insight communities and perhaps more traditional Buddhist sanghas in how they handle this?
In some ways, yes, and in some ways, no. In that, I think what you're pointing to is that the insight movement has the quality that the original founding teachers were lay people, Westerners actually, who had gone to Asia, and many of them had been monastics, and they trained with the Asian masters in Thailand, Burma, and other Southeast Asian countries, Theravadan countries, and then came back. Whereas in the Zen and Tibetan traditions, it was more common that the Asian teachers came over and began to teach Western students in various ways. And so there is an immediate difference in that we have Westerners and lay teachers right away in the insight communities. So in some ways that makes it, maybe a little bit easier in that there isn't that cultural element also. But I would say that there's kind of a spectrum of options for how teachers and organizations relate, and that this is not unique to the particular strand of Buddhism that has come over. So if I could, maybe I'll describe that. On one end of the spectrum, this is mostly a perception, we could call it something like teacher-centric. And this is, maybe where more of the non-insight groups would fit, but many of the insight groups too. And this is a case where the organization sees itself as a support for the teacher. So it exists in order to create the environment such that the teacher can teach, and such that the students can come in and receive the teachings from the teacher. And they see themselves as having that aim. And then, in such a case, when the teacher is moving on, there's sort of a movement of mind. Okay, we should have another teacher. We should fill this void in some way and continue to support that new person. And then a slightly different perspective, and these are really perceptions. The organization could look many different ways, but each of these perceptions is distinct. Is that the best way to replace a teacher is to have a senior teacher replaced by a teacher council, some number of more junior teachers. This is actually the most common approach that we see, often because the teacher has left a number of successors, or because even if it wasn't explicit, there are a number of senior students who have been doing other programs within the community, and so then there would be natural choices. Or there can even be outside teachers coming in for kind of a change of fresh blood. So we have the teacher council model, and this is one where the organization and the teachers end up quite interdependent. So there's more of a sense that the organization and the teachers are going to go forward together, often because these more junior teachers sort of don't have the status or the quite the same degree of respect that that one founding senior teacher had. And then the third of these models is what I would call organization-centric. And this is one where the organization really sees itself as the responsible entity. It believes that it should make choices about which teachers come. It often has set up a strong administrative structure, which could be benign or it could be fairly bureaucratic.
Mm-hmm.
And the sense is, okay, it's our responsibility to now, this organization has to continue. We're going to find some new teachers, but we're going to keep it on kind of as the entity that endures, essentially. And some of them become more administrative, that's their role, and some organization-centric groups become more almost peer-led community-like, so they become sort of more community-like teachers, and they consider everything to be all about the community and the organization. The common thread among these three is that the organization is a player in the teacher succession, which I think is maybe the main point that should be taken away, is that it used to be the teacher and then the people that kind of grew up around that teacher. And now, as that teacher moves on, the successor is not necessarily just the next teacher. The organization is also a successor and also a player in all of this. And if it hasn't done any self-reflection or thought about any of that, it's like a person who hasn't done any self-reflection or thought about who they are and how they're presenting. And so it can be a difficult player in the mix, but it is definitely a player in the mix.
Mm-hmm. You also mention in the paper some things that happen when there is a transition, and you list a few of those, and I just want to read one line about that because of my own experience with this and the stress that you put on it, I think appropriately. And you say in the paper, without exception, this research indicated that strong emotions occur during teacher transitions. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. And I think part of it is you already did, that the organization itself is kind of like a person. They are a player in this.
So several things can happen when teachers are leaving. And of course, there's the grief of the beloved teacher is not going to be present in the community anymore. And so people in grief are often surprised by the strong emotions that come forth somewhat unexpectedly. There can be anger or sadness or fear or despair. And you'll see these same things coming up in organizational transitions, sometimes in the same way as in grief, surprisingly. Suddenly somebody will erupt in a meeting and it's like, wow, what happened? And, they may not really know. And so I think it's very important to hold that within the community and just be aware that, these kinds of things are going to come up. This is a difficult process for everyone. Making the space for that, having a lot of patience and openness about that, which is, of course, something that can be cultivated ahead of time. Communities can ask themselves, are we in a situation where people can say what they're feeling, people can express their emotions, and it will be held and accepted and understood and worked through in the way that it needs to, because these are conditions that can be put in place in a group ahead of time, before the teacher is actually leaving. This has a lot to do with how the group is run in the background. Is it run according to Dharma ideas of respect and love and wise speech and letting go of views and compassion? These good qualities that we develop in our Dharma practice, they're right there in running the community. And the degree to which we adhere to those, is going to have a big effect on how smoothly the transition goes. And I guess one more thing I'll say about emotions is that the teacher also is often playing a role in containing various emotions that are present in communities. When people get together in groups, there's conflict, there's power issues, there's who likes whom, and all of that going on. Skilled, strong senior teachers are aware of all of that and manage that actually in the background. Long-time Dharma practitioners can have strong personalities. And there's a way that a good teacher is kind of managing that in the background. And then when the teacher is pulling away or has died or otherwise is not doing that quite as much, then these issues can kind of come forth of power and of who's supposed to be doing what. And that becomes part of the emotional issues that come forth when the teacher is transitioning.
Yeah, it's something to note that it may not be that the teacher hasn't been suppressing or reducing these strong feelings, these strong talents and energies, but that their absence, for whatever reason, is simply allowing those to flow in ways they haven't before, that might not always be as helpful as they have been appropriately challenged with that strong teacher. So something that you brought up earlier is the relationship between teachers and organizations. And I'm wondering if you might talk for a bit about how that relationship between teachers and the organizations they're in might contribute to practice or sometimes may reduce that support of practice.
Yeah, there's actually a couple different issues in there. So there's the relation between the teacher and the organization, and then there's the relation between the organization and the Dharma practice that goes on there, essentially. And there is, of course, some correlation between all of those, but those are different dimensions. Maybe I'll begin actually with Dharma organizations and how they relate to the Dharma practice that's happening there. One way I'm thinking about it these days is that there's every combination of the organization being skillful or helpful, supportive for practice, and unhelpful for practice. That's one dimension. And then the other is whether the experience of being in the organization is pleasant or unpleasant, to bring in a Dharma dimension. And interestingly, all four of them are there. I'll just give some brief examples. And I'm doing this so that organizations can reflect. Mm-hmm. Organizational leaders and even the teachers can reflect kind of on which of these elements are present. So clearly, organizations are often founded and inspired by the helpful and pleasant aspects of communities. So community support, practicing with other people. This is very important, actually, as we're doing this practice that's something like against the grain of the rest of society that we swim in. It's so important to find other people that are inspired in the same way, that we can learn the Dharma together, people to talk to about Dharma issues, and then develop our practice within this group of people, who's maybe our closest friends. And of course, spiritual friendship is really a foundational factor in walking the path. Mm-hmm. So this is, I would hope, one of the aims and inspirations of many groups. So I put that in supportive and pleasant. But there are aspects of a community, even one that's supportive, that may be challenging. Maybe I shouldn't say unpleasant, but another really useful role for the community is to serve as a mirror for our difficulties, right? So we go to the center and we may learn there through our own interactions places that we're clinging or places that we're stuck in some view or behavior. And those unskillful views and behaviors that we have are not supported within the Dharma presence of the community. And so we get a chance to see that. I know somebody who lived for a while at a Zen center, and one of her strategies was to play social games that would help other people to like her. And that was kind of her main stance in approaching people. And she found that the people at the Zen center did not support that way of being. They gently, kindly pointed her towards other ways of being. So it may not have been so pleasant to see that about herself, but now looking back, she's very grateful that the community played that role of supporting her practice. Mm-hmm. So these are the best ways that Dharma communities can be. But as always, there's a chance that they can change or not always be the most skillful because we're all still practicing. We're all still beings on the path. And so there are other ways where the center itself may become restrictive or not as supportive. And some of them are actually pleasant in that communities can become social clubs. Essentially, they can not have as much of a focus on spiritual practice and development of the seeing our suffering and finding a way to let go of it, but more as a social center, a place to meet people. They can also sometimes get overly nice or fixed on being very, very safe, comfortable spaces. Of course, Dharma centers should be safe for seeing our own pain and being able to work through that. But there can be ways in which there can be little blinders put on. Oh, we're only supposed to act in a certain way,
right,
so we can all be pleasant and happy and nice. This is not so supportive of practice. And then, of course, sliding into the ways that are not helpful and are not even that pleasant to be with is that organizations do have the ability to become exclusive. The flip side of inclusion is exclusion. And people who don't look right, people who don't think in the right way, who don't somehow conform to the cultural ideal, or there can be an exclusivity and a cliquishness that can come through centers. And they can become places that are very difficult to be at for certain people. And then, of course, those people will not stay, and the group will have disharmony and so forth. So we, pushing back toward, it's helpful for groups to reflect. Have we stayed true to our initial inspiration of sharing the Dharma, being a place where people can really come and do the inner work, learn about themselves, and grow in compassion and wisdom so that they can go out from the center and really be of benefit? Are we still doing that?
Kim, have you found that the organizations that you're aware of, and again, reiterating your caveat from the beginning, not even necessarily organizations you've worked with, just ones that are on your radar that you're aware of, does there seem to be a receptivity and an awareness to these kinds of relationships you've described? Is there a willingness to take a hard look sometimes at what their structure might be and how that may or may not be helping the people who are part of the community?
I'm seeing this more and more. One of the things that I've started to do is, I've been asked to do, is serve as an advisor for some groups that are going through teacher transitions or even just organizational transitions of various kinds. It's not only succession planning. And there seems to be a growing recognition that it's useful to think about these structures in the organization as a way of supporting the Dharma practice. I would say that maybe initially there is some suspicion in groups about not wanting to get too structured, not wanting to have a lot of bureaucracy, which is very healthy for a small, young, creative organization. But to really kind of grow and be able to serve more and more people, there comes a point where having no structure or having only a completely flat organization actually doesn't serve anymore. And the group could do better serving its mission if it thought a little bit more about these things. And so I've started to see groups realizing, the conditions have changed, and so what's appropriate to be thinking about changes. And so they come and they say, well, how can we write a better mission statement? How can we put in place a set of programs that helps people when they're beginners and need an introduction to mindfulness class, all the way up through people who want to do the sutta or sutra study and really develop their practice further.
Have you found that there are some common threads that groups keep tripping up on, some difficulties that are pretty endemic to communities that are around today?
Well, one of them is only endemic because of the way we've set up our organizations, which is, and I support that many organizations are completely volunteer run and rely heavily on volunteers. This is very typical for nonprofits. And so there can be challenges with how to recruit volunteers, how to train them, how to have people in volunteer positions that are essentially professional at this point. When the organization becomes large, the person who's the treasurer really could be an accountant.
Mm-hmm.
Finding ways that people are inspired to offer that level of service as volunteers. There are also issues that start to come up when new teachers start to come in. And maybe this will touch a little bit on the teacher-group relationship, which is that almost all groups at this point are starting to have many senior students or younger teachers or other folks coming in. There are relatively few groups that still have only the one senior teacher who is the original founder. And so there can be issues with the Sangha not noticing that it has particular culture about it. And when a new teacher comes and wants to teach in a different way, there can be some challenges from the program committee, for example, of, oh, is this really this isn't usually the way we offer this, something like that. Mm-hmm. So there can be power dynamics actually between teacher and organizational leaders, which are unfortunate in that they cloud the spiritual relationship that could be happening there. But this is the reality, is that if a new teacher is coming into an organization that didn't grow up around that teacher, are the students automatically that teacher's students? Mm-hmm. How does that transfer? What happens with the spiritual relationship there? Of course, Asian monasteries, as well as in this country, Christian churches and Jewish groups and others have much more experience in this kind of thing than our young, nascent Buddhist groups do. Mm-hmm. There are ways in which we would do well to look at some of the models that they've had in place and also some of the challenges.
Kim, is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners?
Maybe I'll put in one reflection question around the word Sangha, which is used in this country to mean a group of practitioners that are practicing the Dharma together. We very casually, when they even said it sometime in this interview, we would say a Dharma community, a Dharma group, a Sangha, and go into the Sangha to meet. This is, I think this is nice in that the word Sangha implies, and we know that's a meditation group. We don't say congregation, although we could in some cases, maybe. One slight catch in my heart around using the word Sangha for a Dharma group is that people can begin to believe that the institution or the organization is the Sangha jewel, is the natural refuge. And I think I'd like to say that an institution is not a refuge. And this is not what's pointed toward in the third jewel. And this is worthy of reflection.
That's a very good point, that we sometimes give the organization, the institution, a self and a tangibility that it perhaps doesn't deserve and doesn't serve the people who are part of that community.
Yeah, it always comes down to the people.
Yeah.
That's an important point to remember as we move toward more and more institutionalization, which is happening. But we shouldn't lose the heart, lose the people.
Our guest today has been Kim Allen. You can find out more about Kim and her work at uncontrived.org, as well as Buddhist Insight Network, and I'll be linking both of those on the episode page for this episode. Kim, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.